Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening. My name is Stephanie Fassler. I'm the International Affairs Director for the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. On behalf of the Council, I welcome you to this Author Series event. Many thanks to our strategic partners, the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center, for their wonderful hospitality and provision of the venue to hold our public events. Our programs are filmed for broadcast at a later date on our nationwide broadcast of our 1-hour weekly television show, World Affairs Today, which airs Sundays at 3 p.m. on MHC Network's Worldview channel. It is also available globally on our YouTube, Facebook, and other social media platforms. Tonight we welcome to our podium Frank Sesno, author of Ask More, The Power of Questions. As the world becomes subject to increased globalization, mastering the art of the right question is invaluable when learning about different cultures and customs. Skillful questions offer a heightened opportunity to innovate and excel when addressing global issues. In this technological age, the benefit of asking good questions while listening and observing is immeasurable. Questions are the simplest, yet the most effective tools for learning, as they are the cornerstones of every field of life, whether that is professional or personal. Our distinguished author, Mr. Frank Sesno, will present how he sees questions having the potential to not only be useful when learning, but also when attempting to uncover solutions and spark change at home and abroad. Mr. Sesno is the director of the School of Media and Public Affairs at the George Washington University. He teaches courses on ethics in journalism, environmental media reporting, and documentary. His career in media and public affairs spans over 30 years, first working at CNN from 1984 to 2005, and holding positions as White House correspondent, anchor, and Washington bureau chief. Mr. Sesno is also the creator of planetforward.org, a website that focuses on energy policy, green jobs, and food production topics. He has been awarded an Emmy, multiple Sinai Golden Eagle Awards, a Lincoln Unity Award, and several ACE Awards, as well as an Overseas Press Club Award. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Frank Sesno at the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. podium.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, and good evening, everybody. It is just a great pleasure to be here, and I look forward to our conversation. I want to start by saying a special shout-out not only to Stephanie, but to someone else in the audience here, and that's Myron Belkind. When I sit and think about the incredible career that I have had and the opportunity I've had to watch the world from the front row of history, Myron was my bureau chief, and more than that, my sort of guiding light when I arrived as a baby correspondent in London. And Myron was very patient and very knowledgeable. And Myron and I are now colleagues at George Washington University. And Myron, thank you very much for everything that you have done, not just for me, but for journalists all over the world in your remarkable career. So here's to you. I have had the most remarkable opportunity, really, to be in that front row of history, that front row seat on history. Sometimes I think of myself as sort of the Forrest Gump a little bit of of journalism, because I was not of journalism, but just in my own world. I was there on the tarmac in Rhine Mine when American hostages came back after having been held by Iran. I was there when Lech Wałęsa went through the shipyards of Gdansk, and when Ronald Reagan at the Brandenburg Gate said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," and on the west front of the Capitol when Barack Obama took the oath of office as the first African American to become president of the United States. And I realized that this incredible opportunity I had as a journalist was powered by really one thing, and that was my curiosity. I didn't know anything about Poland. I didn't know anything about the presidency when I started. Yeah, as a student, I had studied these things. But mostly what powered me and what motivated me And what helped me fill in the blanks, and it was mostly blanks, was the questions. Some of them were pretty basic. Some of them were more sophisticated over time. And as I think about the world we're in now, and I think about the quality of our civil discourse, and when I think about what we are saying to one another around the world and the way we are talking across cultures and across borders, I believe that we have a critical question deficit. We are much quicker with the exclamation point and the assertion and the argument than we are with the question mark and the query and the curiosity. And I'll speak tonight a little bit about how questions connect with something else that's critical, which is learning. Even before learning, listening. What does it take to be a good listener? What kind of pressures are we under that turn us into bad listeners? What kind of a listener are you? Have you ever asked yourself that question? What kind of a listener am I? And I'll talk about that too. But questions, when I started writing this book, I thought, well, this is kind of silly. Nobody's going to care about this. It's so basic. And they're a little bit like air. They're all, it's around us, and we don't think about it until something goes wrong. Our air is dirty and choking us. Our questions are counterproductive and hurting us, or we're not asking at all. I'm not going to read much from the book this evening because mostly I want to make this a conversation. And yes, I look forward to your questions. And I've already asked Tudor here to be sure that they're really hard and snarky because those are the best kind. But I would share this from the book, observing that I've had this remarkable experience, and it's why journalism is such a magical, remarkable field and journey, because you do have license to ask anybody anything. You don't have license to be rude, in my view. You don't have license to be irresponsible. You don't have license to sensationalize or hype or take out of context, but you do have license to ask just about anything. So I wrote this. As my fascination with inquiry has grown, I've become increasingly alarmed about the questions we ask or don't ask in public and daily life. Technology has revealed endless horizons, but it has also created a quick-hit search engine culture where a fast answer can obscure deeper inquiry. The polarization of politics, amplified by social media, and I wrote this before our most recent political cycle, by the way, just before, has fractured civic discourse and infused it with invective instead of dialogue. The news media, reflecting and reinforcing these trends, have grown shorter and sharper. And compared to when I got into the business, television interviewers are given less time and focus more on controversy and horse race than on explanation and substance. Sincere questions too often play second fiddle to certainty, ideology, and outrage. But what if we asked more and asserted less? What would we discover? How much better would we understand the people around us? What if we went asking for solutions and posed truly creative questions that could change the world? Now, I will talk about the world at some length because this is, after all, the World Affairs Council. But it was a student in my class who convinced me that there was a book here and that I should write it. I was teaching a class called The Art of the Interview. There's no such course available, and having done interviews all my life, I came to realize that questions are not sort of random acts of curiosity. No lawyer goes before a judge or a jury and just wings it. Well, at least I hope they don't. Your therapist is not just winging it when you go in if you're going to have a meaningful session. It involves preparation, forethought, a plan, an outcome, a desired outcome, and again, very active listening. So in this class, I offered my students, no, I didn't offer them, I gave them the assignment as their final project of doing an oral history. Find somebody who'd lived a consequential life, research them deeply, and think about them as a story. And how would you evoke that story through a series of questions where they would open up to you, explain their life, offer you the anecdotes that comprised their story, and express it in a way that was clear and compelling. And I told my students, I said, look, for those of you who can, I'd encourage you to interview a family member. They all had to have video cameras there. I said, imagine if you could watch a video of your great-great-grandmother. How interesting would that be? What kind of life did she live? Where did she live? What was it like? Anyway, so about a third of my students took me up on that challenge, and they interviewed a family member, a mother, a father, a grandparent, in one case, an older sister, much older sister. And here's the thing. Every single student who interviewed a family member learned something not merely interesting, but profound, really profound. This one young woman I write about in the book, changed her name, she and her family had lost a child about 2 years before she was born. They commemorated that sad day every year on that child's birthday, but she never really knew what happened, and her parents didn't want to talk about it. So she sat down for the interview, and she did what I like to call, and she started with what I like to call open-ended questions, these sort of very broad, how did you and Mom meet? Tell me that story. Larry King used to do this very successfully on CNN all the time, these very unthreatening questions that allow people to relax and just take a conversation where they want. So her father talked about that. She was interviewing her dad. And a few questions in, after he was comfortable, she said, before I was born, you lost a child. What happened? And the dad started telling her, and he grew very emotional. And she grew very emotional. And he told her what had happened. The child had been born with very, very, very badly deformed lungs, and she lasted 2.5 days. And the parents, in a terrible, wrenching decision, made the decision to end life support for her. The father had never told his parents what had happened. And afterwards, I spoke to her dad for the book. I interviewed him, and I interviewed her. And what they both said was that exchange changed their relationship. She said, well, now when he calls, I answer the phone faster. Good thing for a teenager to say. He said, I realize now, and I told my daughter this, that if it hadn't been for that tragedy, we would not have you in our lives, which was a profound thing for this young woman to hear from her father. What happened? What happened is they made an appointment to sit down. They set an expectation that she would ask and that he would answer. There was trust between them, so that engendered a conversation that could unfold. She asked deliberately, and she listened intently. The actual answer came after a couple of questions where she followed up. That follow-up question, which we talk about in interviewing, is so important. To me, this was a profound lesson, and in fact, in grading her paper, her video and her paper, I thanked her. I said, I want to thank you for allowing me to see this unbelievably intimate moment between you and your father. Because as I was watching it, I almost felt, I don't have any business being here. And yet this was something she shared. And I thought about all the interviewing that I have done when I was in radio and at CNN. People come, they sit down, and they do expect to be questioned. You do listen if you're a good interviewer, at least I hope you do, to see where it's going. And you do follow up. And often it is not the first question. Mostly it is not the first question, but the second, third, or fourth that prompts the answer because you're helping someone go through it. To me, the lesson there was profound. That if we can bring some discipline to our questioning, imagine what we can discover. Now, I think that applies vastly and around the world. I write about different kinds of questions. What I realized as I thought about her experience and mine is what we really do is we ask very differently when we're seeking different things. So if I'm trying to elicit information, I'm asking you about facts, figures, times, places, who, what, when, where, why, right? The basics that we would do in journalism. If I know you're upset about something, and I'm trying to figure out why you're upset or what's making you tick, I'm going to ask a series of questions that I like to call empathetic questions. Each of my chapters here are written around characters. I'm a storyteller. I like to tell stories. And so I've found some of the master questioners out there who are amazing. And so for the empathetic questions chapter, I talked to 3 people. I talked to a family therapist, a woman by the name of Betty Prestera, who's just amazing. I spoke to a woman who studies empathy up at Harvard and teaches it to, of all people, doctors. Any doctors in the room? No? You doctors are supposed to be empathetic, but too often they're down in their computers, or they're moving through so quickly, or they're doing so many other things that they don't have empathic relationships with their patients. And yet research shows that doctors and patients, especially patients who feel they have an empathetic doctor, they actually have better outcomes because they feel they're being listened to and approached in a different way. She teaches that. I'll talk about how in a minute. And then the third person in this chapter is a person by the name of Terry Gross, who does a show on public radio called Fresh Air. Anybody heard Fresh Air? Yeah. Terry is amazing, and she loves to interview authors and artists and musicians and creative people. And she seeks to figure out and to explore with them what she calls the essence of who they are as a person. Where does that creativity spring from? Often it comes from adversity or some remarkable experience in life. Are we asking the empathetic questions of people we don't know in the right ways? When we think about this past election and the criticism of media coverage, and we think about the kind of media coverage of people talking about people instead of talking to and with people, I don't think we asked the right questions. I don't think we sought to ask empathetically and to connect so that we could stand in the shoes of somebody else and really think what it's like to be, whether it's the coal miner in West Virginia, or the small business person in Silicon Valley, or the peanut farmer in Georgia, or the Boeing worker in the Northwest, or the refugee from Syria, or the small child from Yemen, or any of these places around the world that we hear about in passing but don't understand unless somebody can take us there and help us connect through empathetic questioning. Someone who does this uncommonly well, and I spent time with him too, is Anderson Cooper. If you've ever seen Anderson Cooper in the field, there's a wonderful, wonderful interview that he did in a hut on a mud floor with a young woman who'd been brutalized in Africa. And he is asking her what happened and how she survived and how she carried on and about her children in ways that are not just curious but caring. And that ability to care and ability to seek to empathize in the questioning you do is vital. Now, in this diet of questioning, a critical type of questioning, and this is something that the media must do and does, and maybe binges on, but does, is confrontational or accountability questioning, right? One of the most important things that journalists and journalism should be is about holding those in power to account. If you say something, where does it come from? How do you know? How are you going to support it? Are you consistent? Are you flipping? Are you telling the truth? Are you lying? All right? And it is up so much a part of what journalism should be is leaning on people, whether they are presidents or governors or mayors or CEOs or priests, holding them accountable for the public trust that they have. I talked to Anderson about confrontational questioning. That's the chapter that he is in. Because as wonderfully empathetic as he is, he says he has come to realize that these questions, these accountability questions, are now the most important that he must ask. He does not like it. And as I say, these are the questions that are the toughest. They're the blunt force instruments of inquiry. Because if you accuse, if you challenge, if you reveal someone's hypocrisy or falsehood or wrongdoing, probably they're not going to like you very much. And we have a couple of examples in this town these days of people who don't like people who do that. That's not fake news, by the way. That's not fake news. That's journalists doing their jobs. The other person who's remarkably good at this is Jorge Ramos. Jorge Ramos works for Univision. And Jorge has been all over the world. He's done this with President Semper, the former President Semper of Colombia, and Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, and Fidel Castro. He's confronted them directly and gotten himself thrown out of countries and gotten threats, including a funeral spray of flowers delivered to him one time. And he says, my job is not to be popular. My job is not to go and interview somebody and want to be interviewing them again in the future. My job is to confront. I mean, he says that. That is what he believes his job is, to hold you to account, to ask that for-the-record question that the world will be able to come back to and judge you on later. Now, all that being said, and we can talk some more about media later if you'd like, I do fear that there is a danger in the kind of accountability, confrontational questioning that media do and that happens. I do think there's a diet of questions, and confrontation, accountability is very important in the world of journalism. But so is empathy. So are solution questions, questions that evoke solutions. So are questions that build bridges among people who are otherwise hostile or suspicious of one another. But there may be too much binging on the confrontation going on in much of media today. I think that's especially prevalent in talk radio and talk television. And the impression that we get from that is that we're not listening to one another. We're not really asking. We're asking to provoke, but we're not asking to understand. And there's a very, very significant difference. I did CNN's Sunday talk show. It was called Late Edition at the time, for 7 years. And I stopped doing it because I had kids and I kind of needed to spend some weekend time with my children. As I said in my last broadcast, late Sandy Berger was my guest, the national security advisor at the time. I said, television can be done on videotape. That's what we used at the time. But children are best raised live and in person. So with great sadness, I cut away from that. But I've continued to do a lot of interviewing and a lot of panels and that kind of thing because I'm fascinated by people. I think people are great stories, and drawing them out through questions are great. But if I were doing that show again today, I think I'd do it completely differently. Well, maybe not completely differently, but very differently. I would be more deliberate going into an interview as to what I wanted out of it. I would be narrower in the questions that I asked to be more on target and not all over the map, because that provides, you're too general and people can either run the clock out or you can be a mile wide and an inch deep. I would be more provocative in places and, frankly, softer in places. When I was at CNN, Larry King used to drive the reporters crazy because Larry would ask questions like, Myron, why'd you write the book? How you doing? It's like, oh, come on, Larry. Larry famously said, I don't read the author's books before they come on the air. You go, huh? I was sitting in for Larry one time. I called down to the producers. I said, so I've got so-and-so on the show today, and I know we've got a book. Can you send the book up? And there's silence on the other end of the phone. They said, well, what do you want the book for? I said, well, to read it. And they said, well, Larry doesn't read the book. And Larry's talked about this publicly. This is, I'm not saying anything out of school. And we kind of made fun of Larry a little bit with this. But Larry's point was, I want to ask the question that my viewer who hasn't read the book will ask. And the way I would ask a question is I would say, Myron, on page 227, you write. And Larry's going to say, Myron, why'd you write the book? Anyway, there's a happy medium somewhere in between, obviously. But engaging people with genuine interest and providing them that running room is very important for them to open up, and then you listen and follow up. There's another critical question, type of question that I write about here that I think is missing, painfully missing today, that I talk about, and that's bridge building. And this is very interesting. There's so much suspicion and hostility in the world. There's so much adversarial noise out there. You can use questions, and we can use them very effectively, to bridge that divide. So think about a hostage negotiator, what a hostage negotiator does. They're just trying to get you talking, right? Well, in bridge building questions, there's a fellow by the name of Barry Spodak. Barry Spodak was, as a young man, we worked at St. Elizabeth's. You all know where St. Elizabeth's here is in town? For those who were watching this, St. E's was the psychiatric hospital here in Washington. Barry Spodak was John Hinckley's group therapist. John Hinckley, who shot Ronald Reagan. And he went into what is called dangerous threat assessment. So if somebody writes a threatening letter to the President of the United States, or makes some noise like they're going to go shoot up a mall, God forbid, or something like that, and that letter falls in the hands of law enforcement, what you have to do is determine, is that person just making noise and angry or sick, or is that person likely to do that? And so Barry trains the Secret Service, FBI, and U.S. Marshals on how to question those people. And it's really fascinating. Waterboarding does not work. And what he does is he will pose this very interesting question, which I call a question without a question mark. And it's something that we can all incorporate in our lives in one way or another. And he'll say, so, tell me, sir, do you think the president is the Antichrist and flies around in a black helicopter and is going to ruin the country? A lot of people think that way. Tell me about that. Tell me about that. He doesn't endorse what the person has said. He doesn't say he's right. But he, by simply putting it in a statement, repeats it. Now think about this person on the receiving end of this. They're angry, they're hostile, they're isolated, they may be mentally ill, whatever it is, but they're hearing their words coming back at them, and they're not being asked, are you going to kill the president? They're being asked to speak, to tell me about that. I almost entitled this chapter of Terrorists and Teenagers, because I thought of my kids as teenagers, and the ones I know, they're skeptical of authority, think I'm out to get them, right? Think it's a power thing. And how effective is it to simply say to someone, to lay out a predicate and say, tell me about that? This question without a question mark, I think, is very powerful. Creative questions. John Kennedy did this when he asked us to go to the moon. Helping us think outside of our realm. What would peace in the Middle East look like? What would stability on the Korean Peninsula involve? What is America's role in the world? What do we mean by leadership? What responsibilities come with that? It's 5 years from now, and the immigration problem isn't a problem anymore. What are we doing? I especially like this construct of taking a future concept or idea, asking a question or posing a scenario or a situation in future tense and marrying it to a question in the present tense. It's 5 years from now, such and such is taking place, or we are the best company on the block, or we have peace in the Middle East. Question, what are we doing? You invite people with a question like that to time travel. You invite people like that to combine intellect and imagination. And that is a fascinating process. McKinsey has done some very interesting research on brainstorming sessions, corporate brainstorming sessions, and posing questions that prompt people to get out of their place and their familiar zone and transport themselves to another time or place is a way. We were talking, Mitzi, earlier about granting people license to question. You grant people license to imagine. You grant people license to articulate their aspiration through the question that you ask. What are some of the building blocks of this kind of thing? And I just got back from, I was in Europe 2 weeks ago, and I was speaking to people in the security realm about fake news and how they and we are going to communicate in a world filled with those who would produce news or information or propaganda or lies that looks like legitimate news. And everywhere I went, people were asking me too, what's going on in America with your politics now? What are you people thinking and doing? And what does it mean about your country's willingness to lead? Can we count on you? Are you good for your word? Now, those questions are a lot easier than the answers, by the way. And what I realized is that these questions that I was being asked as a visitor are the kinds of things that we need to be asking ourselves as a country, prominently and repeatedly. And like the young woman I told you about, several layers down. We need the media to do that. We need our political leaders to do that. We need our civic leaders to do that. I'm going to take your questions in a few minutes here, but I do want to talk for a moment about one of the biggest challenges in this area and that connects with the World Affairs Council, and that is coverage of global affairs in the United States. I mean, we have not, and I think it connects to my theme here too, I don't think we've laid out, we've tried, but I don't think we've laid out convincingly why it matters. I mean, international news, global news in local and regional newspapers is almost non-existent. International news on cable news channels is almost non-existent unless something blows up and Americans are killed. International news is defined through the prism of conflict, what I like to call bombs, bullets, and ballots. But what about the Palestinian scientist? What about the African entrepreneur? What about the Chinese inventor? What about the Saudi woman who's starting a business? These are great stories, and they add context, and they make things personal, and they explain so much more than just the story. But getting that in front of an audience is really, really challenging. Producers and editors don't think it's news, and now, of course, today, when we can measure the metrics of any given story, if it doesn't click, it's not going to be revisited. But I refuse to accept that. And I think that the failure to do this kind of reporting is actually a failure of, well, a lot of people, but I would include the editors and the producers who are calling the shots. It's a failure of on their part to be asking the right questions of their reporters and of themselves to figure out what is interesting and where the story is. 60 Minutes is celebrating its 50th year on television this year, which is an amazing thing. And Don Hewitt, who launched the program, famous Don Hewitt, executive producer, had this famous line, and it was really simple. Tell me a story, which is what 60 Minutes does every week. They find someone amazing, they tell it compellingly, they write it pointedly and clearly, they illustrate it with amazing pictures. That's what you do when you have the time and the resources to do that. And they can make me interested in the phone book, right? Because here's the guy who spent all of his life doing phone books. Huh? Why is it so hard to get people and get news organizations interested in what's happening around the world, when what's happening around the world affects us so profoundly? This is one of the big questions I have of this moment in history. When globalization and culture and trends and people and ideas and businesses and jobs travel so fast and over borders with such supersonic speed, we're somehow not interested in that? I don't buy that. I don't believe that. Where does your television come from? Where do your clothes come from? Where have you traveled? Where is your kid going? Where is the coal you're digging going or the corn you're growing? There are ways to make those stories compelling. We have to ask the right questions, though, to set them up. It's like a researcher. If you're a faculty member, right, the research question is what starts your research. That's what the scientist does. I'll close with a conversation about one other category here, and then an observation or two, and then open it up to your questions. One other category of question I have, speaking of research, is science. There's a great lesson to be learned by science. Any scientists in the room? All right. What kind of scientist are you? Geologist, all right. So the wonderful thing about science is it's about the physical world, right? The observable world, the world around us. And we ask how or why something works in a way it does. And you pose a question, and you develop a hypothesis. And then what do scientists do? They go to work testing and measuring and trying to prove their hypothesis wrong. Now, if we think about political discourse in this country, do we try to prove ourselves wrong? No, we're just trying to prove ourselves right. And the idea of asking ourselves incredibly challenging questions is, if not foreign, then at least too unfamiliar. One of the most poignant experiences for me in doing this book was the half day I spent with General Colin Powell. I've covered Colin Powell since he was in the Reagan White House and I was there, and I have enormous respect for him. I wanted to talk to Colin Powell about strategic questions, about looking over the horizon, dealing with uncertainty, not in the scientific sense, but maybe life and death uncertainty, assessing risk. Do you know that Colin Powell had 8 questions that he walked into George Herbert Walker Bush with before they went into Iraq, Kuwait actually, in Desert Storm? Anybody familiar with that? I'll find these for you because they're really interesting. And they are 8 questions that he said to the president, Mr. President, only if we can say yes to all of these would I recommend going in on the ground into Kuwait. And the questions were designed to challenge conventional thought and personal biases, and to make sure that they really tested, as I say, conventional wisdom. Here are the 8 questions he asked. This is when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and going in on the ground. Is a vital national security interest threatened? Is the action that they were contemplating supported by the American people? Do we have genuine broad international support? Have the risks and costs been fully and frankly analyzed? Have all other nonviolent policy means been fully exhausted? Have the consequences of our action been fully considered? Do we have a clear, attainable objective? Is there a plausible exit strategy to avoid endless entanglement? And by deliberately posing those questions and forcing the room to answer them, he forced a conversation that went way beyond mere supposition, gut, or whatever might drive a decision like this, serious as it was. And the answer was yes in all cases. As you may recall, President George Bush had gone around the world, so had his Secretary of State James Baker, building international coalition. There was a UN vote, there was a congressional vote, public opinion was behind it. There had been endless conversation, negotiation with Tariq Aziz and all the Iraqis. And we went in. Anybody remember how long the ground war in Kuwait lasted? 100 hours. 100 hours. And as Colin Powell says, and this isn't the only reason this is the case, but these sorts of questions in that sort of way were not asked before the second war in Iraq, and we are still there. Now, that doesn't mean that these questions by themselves, had they been posed, would have led to a different outcome, because it also reflects an attitude, and that's important too. Great questioners are great listeners, are great learners. I did talk about listening. I want to do this, and then I promise to go to your question. Spoke to a phenomenal person for this book, and she said, "Do you know what kind of a listener you are?" I said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Well, have you asked yourself, what kind of a listener are you?" And I said, "Sure, of course I have." "No, I haven't." What do you mean?" So she said, and she has pages of questions that she poses to herself, and this is one of them. Are you an interrupter? Are you a gap filler? Does silence make you uncomfortable? Do you listen for fact and data? Do you listen for story and person? Are you easily distracted? Do you do email in the middle of a conversation? Do you make eye contact as you listen? Do you listen with your eyes as well as your ears? And I loved what she said. I loved it because it made me think about, as you can tell, I can yap. And I actually try to shut up. I tell myself before a meeting, please shut up going into this meeting. I ask myself, what am I listening for? Because we listen for different things. Am I listening for information? Am I listening for emotion? Am I listening for revelation? Am I listening for connection? Am I listening for, in the case of accountability, hesitation, inconsistency, untruth? What am I really listening for? And how am I going to do it? Which then helps me inform my next question. Stringing questions together. Questions like grapes come in bunches, good ones. And that's what holds them together, is terrific listening. The world's in a very unpleasant and confused state right now. We don't know maybe who our friends and enemies are in the same way that we once did. We don't know what our role is in the world in the way we once did. Life is complicated. Fareed Zakaria talks about the rise of the rest. You know, that makes us uncomfortable all by itself, to suddenly make room for China and India and other countries that are, in fact, competing. Asking the right questions of ourselves, of our leaders, of others will be more important now than before, because we're going to need to be smarter and know more. We're going to need to have a broader perspective and be more empathetic and hold people to account in more and different ways than we have in the past. Because with this complexity, and in a democracy, right, it falls on us. I would love to see in the media a little less binging and a little bit more listening. I would love to see in the media a more transparent curiosity. Why are we asking? What are we getting at? Because people want to know that. And I hope that in thinking about the young woman who sat down with her dad and learned so much simply by asking, that maybe that can be a model for a lot bigger and more global things. Thank you very much. I'd love your questions now.
I'm Mitzi Wertheim with the Naval Postgraduate School, and I started life at the Peace Corps and ended up at what I call the War Corps. I've spent the last 40 years with the Pentagon. When I got there, and the question is, how do you change society to do what you think we all ought to do? But when I got to the Pentagon, the last thing you wanted to do was ask a question, because you were exposing your ignorance as opposed to exposing your curiosity. How do we make that happen? I mean, my own view is you put it into the personnel reward system, the performance system, and you say, we're going to measure you on curiosity. But I sat through endless hours of meetings where most people walked out not knowing what they'd heard, because nobody asked, what do you mean?
Yeah. I don't think there's any one way to make it happen, to change the culture. There are a lot of ways. So when I was a kid, I probably should have started this. I just was curious. I just asked a lot of questions. It's sort of in my bones. So when I was in 4th grade, we were starting to shoot astronauts up into space. So I went to my mom one day and I said, Mom, you know, with all this weightlessness and all this kind of stuff, how do they go to the bathroom? So my mom did what most of us would do. She was very straightforward with me and forthcoming, and she said, you know, you should ask your teacher that. So I did. I asked my 4th grade teacher that. Miss Shimilevsky, I think her name was. I still remember her. I do believe the color drained out of her face when I asked that question, and she said, I'll have to look into that. And she came back a couple days later, and she literally took me out into the hall to answer the question. because you didn't talk about things like that back then in front of fourth graders. Now you can, I guess, talk about anything, but anyway. So I think some of it is just ingrained in us, and as kids, our children are like constant questions. Why this? Why that? Why mommy? Why daddy? Why daddy? And finally you say stop. So the first thing is we should encourage that in our children. We should encourage that. Secondly, and growing up, we need leaders, whether they are managers in departments or secretaries of state, to encourage culturally a process, I think, of questioning and challenging. I write about a fascinating guy in here in the creative questioning chapter, a guy by the name of Ed Bernero. Ed Bernero is a Hollywood showrunner. I didn't want to be completely nerdy and do everything inside Washington here. So I went out to Hollywood. How do you encourage creativity through great questioning? And Ed told me, if I tell a room of writers that I think the Volkswagen should be yellow, they'll say, oh yeah, the Volkswagen, because they all want their jobs, right? They're all pandering to the showrunner. If I say, what color should the car be, it's a completely different response. He told a great story of shooting a scene in a detective film, in a police film, with an actor and a suspect. And the sun is shining on the actor, and the actor who's playing the detective is wearing sunglasses. And at a particular moment, he's got to take the sunglasses off, and then he's going to make eye contact with this woman. And that's going to be the moment we see that happen. And they're shooting the scene, and they can't get it right. And he finally goes, he says, cut, take 5, everybody. And he goes up to the actor, he says, look, when do you think, when you take your sunglasses off, that's the first moment we're going to see you make eye contact. That's when we get a sense of sort of the human dimension between the two, the human dynamic between the two of you. When do you think you should take your sunglasses off? Now, he could have said, on the third line at the word however, take your sunglasses off, but it would have then been a mechanical response. And what Ed told me so resonated. He said, actors consider themselves artists. They do not want to be treated like puppets on a string. Well, I don't think anybody wants to be treated like a puppet on a string. And so he empowers people and tells them to ask, and he asks. I think that's what needs to happen, Mitzi. I followed Jack Welch around a couple times, former CEO of GE. He's renowned for this. He'll work a room, and where are you from, and what do you want to do? And he would go out regularly. He wrote about this in his book with 27-year-olds who worked for GE to ask them what their professional trajectory was and all the rest. And he is a question machine. So I think it comes from the top. I also think it can be driven from the bottom. But sometimes that can be lonely, because if you're in a hostile environment and you're made to feel like a fool if you ask a question, it's pretty hard to buck that. But I say do it anyway.
I want to ask a follow-up. I was stunned by my impression that most journalists didn't go to the middle of the country during the campaign.
Yes.
And the question I have for you is, why?
Because we stopped asking and started asserting. Because we thought we knew it all. Because we read the polls and there were the answers, rather than going out and talking to people. Polls are really important. Surveys are vital. But I was talking to a BBC reporter after the election. She said, I had this sense that Trump was going to win. I said, why? Because she said, I went out to the middle of the country and all I saw was Trump signs. I mean, that's just this kind of completely anecdotal, non-scientific thing. And that's what journalists do. We tell stories, right? You have to talk to people. And sometimes, and you listen. How is somebody saying this? With what degree of passion? It's more than, you learn this. I mean, Myron, you know this, right? You intuit things after a while, and you can connect to experience. It doesn't replace polling. It doesn't replace data analytics. And, what Nate Silver and all the rest do is great. But guess what? We're still human beings. And so I think we stopped asking. I also think that we have problems in our newsroom of too little diversity, to include too little diversity from those parts of the country. And I think we've got too much of especially in talk radio and talk television, too much of a keep it in the studio thing. We'll just talk to one another. Well, forget that. Go out and give it the time it needs. And ask. That's where the empathetic questioning and the learning questioning comes from. What is life like?
Given the information that we all have access to, has our questions that we ask in society become smarter, dumber, or non-existent? Second question, how do we clone Colin Powell or bring him back to active life?
He ain't coming back. I asked him. I'm done, he says. And I don't, we're not going to go back in time. We're not going to go back in time. What we need to be looking for now is the next generation of leaders and the next generation of Colin Powell, whatever he and she looks like. Are we asking, I don't know if we're actually asking more questions.
Okay.
We're actually asking more questions. Every time you go on Google and you ask, that's a question. What I am somewhat concerned about is what I call the search engine culture, this idea of you ask that question, you get an answer, and you move on. You don't process it, perhaps. You're asking tactically for the moment instead of perhaps stringing it together. I think that we are very challenged in the social media world in which we live. There is so much noise, so much information, that we are going to have to be much better as questioners. I asked everybody in this book what their favorite question was. And then, stupidly, when I was doing a radio interview, somebody said to me, "What's your favorite question?" And I thought, oh, that's kind of good. I hadn't thought about that, but now I have. And my favorite question, and the question I think we need to be asking more and more and more, is simply this: how do you know? Okay, where's the information come from? How good is the source? Is there a source? Do you know where the source's information comes from? Does the source have an agenda? And the source, by the way, whether it's a source you read in the paper or the doctor or the mechanic you're talking to, you, the news consumer, need to be that hard-edged questioner and re-questioner. So I think the responsibility has shifted. When Myron and I were in London, the responsibility rested with the editor or the producer, and that was the person who was the gatekeeper on information. Now there are very few gatekeepers on information, and so now it's the recipient of the information who needs to be the gatekeeper to the quality of their own, and that is very challenging because, as we know, if people want to listen to a particular point of view or hang out in a particular place, that's what they're completely free to do that. What responsibility do they have to participate? So, to get to your question, I think that there are a lot more distractions now. We move much more quickly now. We are a 140-character culture now. John and Abigail Adams are not writing letters to one another anymore. Those wonderful, wonderful, deep, thoughtful letters, maybe some people are writing them, but I doubt very much someone's going to dig up our tweets 150 years from now and say, "God, that guy was brilliant." It's probably not going to happen. So I think it's challenging. I think it's different, but you can do it. To the graduate students, you can do it because you're doing the research. You're learning how to do this, right? And it's critically important that we, I think, back to Mitzi's question, infuse this in our culture by those who are doing it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yes, hi. My name is Bill Harmon. I just happened to be down here this week from the state of Maine, so I'm very fortunate to have spotted your presentation tonight about a month ago and said, "That looks cool. I got to go."
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that.
I have a question, but
I
I
do
want
love Maine, by the way.
I'm sorry?
I do love Maine.
A lot of people do.
Yes.
So do I, except for the wintertime.
Hey, well, there's that.
Anyway, I want to preface it with a comment about something because it relates to my question. When I arrived here tonight, I was waiting over the reception area, having a conversation with a gentleman there. His wife walks on over. We're having a conversation. We start asking some questions and responding to the questions and more questions. And all of a sudden, I find out I knew her father from 40 years ago in graduate school. I mean, what are the odds of something like that? But that's just an example of asking questions and following up with either information for me. So my question, though, is, at what point does continuously asking questions but not responding on, basically having a conversation, at what point do questions become a bit too much, maybe binging, as you use the expression, versus having that conversation?
It's a great question. I experience this with my kids a lot, They'd sit around the table. I want to know what they did in school today, what they learned, what their friends were doing, what the teacher said. "Dad, stop playing reporter with me," So there is a line, all right? There is a line. Look, I think Helen Reese, who's the expert on empathy, talks about really keying in on the person you're talking to, watching them, watching their body language, watching their facial expression, listening to their voice tone. She tells doctors to do this, but I think this applies to anybody. You can generally tell. I tell a story about a neighbor, and his wife was quite ill with cancer, and he had not opened up much, but everybody cared about him in the neighborhood. And he was just a very private guy, and I was really feeling badly, and I was in the middle of this, and I was really thinking about, okay, how can I do this? So I said to him one day, how's your wife doing? He says, not well. I said, well, how are you doing? He says, not well. I thought, okay, well, do I just leave this? So I had one other one and I said, well, how's your head? And he said, wow. And he started to talk to me about that. Now, that was the moment, and that was him. But 2, 3 times, if you go beyond that and people they're still holding back, you've got to take that cue. You listen to their voice tone. Do they feel comfortable? Does it sound like they're comfortable? Are they opening up? Or are they answering perfunctorily? If I find someone's answering perfunctorily and it's something I really care about, or I feel that, how was your weekend? Fine. There's a really interesting story in here with a woman I met who worked at the Ritz-Carlton, and the Ritz-Carlton trains all of its workers to respond. Like if somebody comes in and a couple is fighting, or the wife or the husband are really short, to get them to process that they probably had a rough day, and you ask them how they're doing, and you sort of see what they say. But you really have to take that lead and try to squint with your ears.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
My pleasure. Thank you very, very much. I appreciate your hospitality.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.